Joining us now on Practical 365 is Alex Weinert, and of course I've got my hosts with me, Paul and Rich. Hi fellas.
Howdy.
Hello.
Hey.
Well, today we're here joined, like Steve said, with Alex Weinert, the Vice President of Identity Security. Today we're going to deep dive a little bit, but we want to really get an insider's look about the Microsoft Storm-0558 event. Okay? So I'm not going to recap that event too much. I think everyone has read about it. Everybody understands it, at least that wants to understand it. If you do want to know more, Paul graciously authored a great blog on the topic, so go check it out at practical365.com. But today, Alex, I really want to get into, an insider's look behind the curtain about that incident. Tell us first about your role at Microsoft.
Yeah, so I'm the Vice President for Identity Security at Microsoft. And in that role, I look after really two distinct functions. The first one is stuff that you are probably familiar with and your customers are familiar with, which is products like conditional access, our multi-factor authentication offerings, our credentials framework, all the risk detection work that we do, and the way that shows up in identity protection, the ability to use that risk to influence your policies, password protection, the Authenticator app. Like there's just a huge suite of stuff that we do for customer security. And then sort of in the gray area between the two things is we also do a lot of feature work that you'll never see. So we block, for example, out of hand about 4,000 identity attacks a second in our infrastructure. And we don't talk to customers about that. Like those are things that are obviously bad enough that we don't feel like customers need to be disturbed by it, right? So when attackers are cleaning big lists of credentials or whatever, we would simply look at that, block the attack out of hand, and then hand you back and say, hey, we think this attacker has your user credential. So there's we also are responsible for fighting fraud in our ecosystem. So trying to make sure that the artifacts you're interacting with, whether it's an identity or a tenant or an application, that those are valid entities, right? That we're catching the fraudsters as they try to use our systems to defraud our customers, either financially or to propagate phishing campaigns or whatever. So that's kind of the product suite. And then the other side of it is that we own a team called Internal Security, and the Internal Security team has the job of ensuring that we build and operate our infrastructure at the highest levels of security, and sort of constantly questing to get better and better at that. And in that function, we own things like the identity hunt team. So when there's an incident, this is the team that goes to work and figures out what was the blast radius for the incident, what customers were impacted. They own the mitigation function. So their job is essentially to take an attack from detection to mitigation. We have product security teams that are responsible for looking at every incident that happens and figuring out what do we do to detect that in the future? What do we do to prevent it in the future? We have a hunt team that's job is to look through and essentially try to find flaws before adversaries do. They run things like our red team program, bounty programs, pen testing programs, audit programs, that sort of thing. So there's a big part of that apparatus that is working that side, including the compliance pieces of it, of making sure that things get fixed in the way that they should get fixed. Coding standards, build standards, all that kind of stuff. And so that second half of the team, that internal security team, probably bears more on the Storm incident. And as part of that, we work really comprehensively across the company and the industry on these sort of global scale identity events. So we're not doing, sort of the day-to-day, like when we do some stuff where like, hey, your account got hacked, but we're more concerned when it's a matter of like, nation one is attacking nation two with cyber, or where there's threats to the election systems or the healthcare systems of the world or the infrastructure like that. So the global security issues are where we tend to get more involved, or where things are particularly tricky. One such incident, we were working with our friends in a team called Mystic. Mystic does advanced persistent threat actor analysis. And then we have friends in a team called Dart, and Dart does per customer engagement. So really on-prem, like going in with a customer where they've had an on-prem Active Directory compromise or on-prem compromise. And the intersection of those two teams and our team kind of came together on this event where we had a customer detected bad activity in their environment, and then brought in Dark to help them with it. And Dark quickly determined that they needed to bring us and the Office security team and the Mystic teams together. And then we isolated both who was doing the action, why they were doing it, and how they were doing it. And we were able to respond from that.
I mean, is there any other, those three teams that you mentioned, do they regularly work together? Or is this just because of, okay, so this is a normal part of the process?
Well, unfortunately, nation state, like I think we did, literally thousands of nation state notifications last year. So, as identity professionals, I think that we quietly, most of us got into this industry because we understood how important this stuff was. I think the world is cottoning on to it at this point. Like when you think about the critical nature, especially in a world where more and more workers are remote, more and more systems are remote, we're assigning identity to everything from, operational technology on a factory floor to, the door on a building, to the applications that you're interacting with, right? So what that means is that essentially we're converging on a place where all systems and therefore all value has a digital front, right? And as you do that, you get to a place where you say, well, every one of those interactions has to be supported by strong authentication and strong authorization. And so then identity becomes the center. And that's why we see the majority of attacks are, identity-centric attacks, right? Attackers realize that however good the encryption is, however good the protection or whatever, if I can pretend to be you, I can bypass those things. Yeah, and so that's absolutely the preferred attack surface, right?
Yep.
Governments have not missed this. Like if you can turn off the power in a city or you can turn off the communications in a city with a cyber attack, then that's very interesting. And so governments are in that game as well. And so we have, major players either for espionage, as was the case here, or for direct attacks, as we saw, for example, in Ukraine. We've seen Iran recently do attacks that were cyber and that had direct impact on life infrastructure. The sort of the stakes keep getting higher for identity professionals, and so we have a team that supports that. Unfortunately, our interactions, fortunately, I like the people a lot, like the people who run the Mystic team and the Dart team are personal friends and really great people.
That makes it easier.
And so, so I guess I don't want to say unfortunately, we have to talk about work a lot together. Almost, I would say a couple times a week, we have, reasons to have professional conversations.
I want to give some time to these gentlemen before I hand over. Was there anything different about this particular experience? I mean, this was a pretty significant, different type of, incident outside of, other norms that we've heard with a key like this. So how was this different in your experience with your team's experiences?
Well, certainly, this would qualify as one of the sort of the worst days you can have, right? Like,
okay, that's what I want to get to.
Yeah.
Tell me about that pain, sir.
Yeah, I think we had one time, that we had the concern that this was happening, and I joked at that time that I hoped to retire before, it actually happened, right?
Yeah.
And I used to joke that I could say, hey, I've had this exceptionally long tenure in this space, and I could, say, okay, it didn't happen to us. And unfortunately, it did happen. A key sure. compromise is a really significant event. And I think there's a lot of things about this key compromise that we can look at, we can learn from. It's important to note that the key that was compromised was created a long time ago in systems that don't exist today. And all the systems that are around key management have been substantially hardened, not just because of this event, but just because of the natural progression of systems in our world. So there's a lot of lessons we can learn from it. But I would say that in the moment, and I think probably most of us have had some kind of a crisis experience in our lives, and where, essentially you think, well, okay, I'm going to panic later, I'm going to freak out later. And so I think that was kind of probably the biggest sense of it is like, okay, if this is happening, we need to get to work and we know what to do. We've tabletopped it, we've thought it through, so we knew how to act fast. And I think the response function was pretty remarkable. I mean, from the point at which we had the idea that this might be happening to the point where we had fully mitigated the situation was measured in, less than 24 hours. And so that's kind of a positive. Like when you compare that to SolarWinds, where we had about 145 customers impacted, some of which are still trying to get the actor out of their environments. The actors have been in those environments for 18 months prior to detection, in some cases. And, the mitigation there was customer by customer. In this case, we had 25 organizations impacted. We detected the attack almost at onset, and we were able to mitigate it fully in 24 hours on behalf of the customers. So certainly the response function has gotten better. And so there are a lot of ways, both in terms of scope and response, that this was a less significant event than SolarWinds in terms of customer impact. But, for the people that have said, hey, look, the hypothetical blast radius here was very large. Yeah. It was certainly a very large hypothetical. Yeah. And what stopped it from being larger was essentially the fact that we were able to centrally mitigate it, detect it so fast and mitigate it so fast. But yeah, it's the second worst thing I think that could happen. The first worst thing would be compromising the infrastructure itself. And so, where we've seen other industry partners who've had actors actually inside their production environments, that this wasn't that. What this was operational error that resulted in the leakage of the key material outside of the secure environment where it should have been kept. And that's a combination of systems that weren't as mature as they are now and just human error, and so that's what resulted in this particular issue.
Well, I could ask you a million questions, but I'm going to hand it over to our resident Exchange MVP, Paul. Paul, why don't you go take it over?
The first question that comes to mind, Alex, is when I think of old school Exchange, right? There are always two kind of patterns in play, and customers will always pick one. One pattern is, I want to do what Microsoft does because they have specified the right way to do it. So that gave us things like active clustering in Exchange, old school. The other pattern is, I'm not going to do what Microsoft does because I'm not Microsoft, right? So we see both those patterns come into play in different security circumstances. And I guess what I'm wondering here is, what would you tell customers that they should be doing differently or should stop doing? What lessons should customers draw from the way that Microsoft responded to, investigated, mitigated this incident?